In this episode, we're diving into the unraveling of Reconstruction, the moment when the lofty promises of equality and freedom for all began to collapse. Reconstruction had brought some progress, but by the mid-1870s, that progress was unraveling fast. How did things fall apart? Why did the promises made to millions of freedmen fail to materialize? The beginning of the end came in 1874 with the death of Senator Charles Sumner, one of the fiercest champions of radical Reconstruction. Sumner's death left the radical Republicans leaderless and diminished their influence in Congress. The political landscape was shifting, and the momentum for a racially just South began to falter. But more was at play than just political leadership. A widening chasm was growing between the goals of freedmen, who wanted land, education, and autonomy, and the priorities of Republican policymakers, whose main focus was to reincorporate ex-Confederates into the Union and build a booming national economy. It was becoming clear that Northern political leaders, more concerned with national unity and economic growth, were losing interest in enforcing the rights of freed African Americans. Adding to this growing disillusionment were voices like James Pike, whose book, The Prostrate State, claimed that South Carolina had fallen into a state of black barbarism. The author's portrayal of African Americans as unfit to govern fueled racist resentment in both the North and South and weakened support for the very idea of multiracial democracy. But the blows to Reconstruction didn't stop there. The Grant administration, already seen as heavy-handed in its military approach to the South, was rocked by scandal, further discrediting the Republican leadership. One of the most infamous was the Credit Mobilier scandal of 1872, where key Republican lawmakers were implicated in a scheme involving the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. Executives at the Credit Mobilier Company created fake construction accounts to siphon millions of dollars into their own pockets, while giving congressmen stock in the company to ensure their silence. This was followed by the Whiskey Ring scandal in 1875, where a group of politicians, distillers, and government agents defrauded the federal government of millions in whiskey tax revenues. Even Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, was implicated in the ring, but Grant shielded him from prosecution, deepening public mistrust and undercutting Grant's ability to oversee Reconstruction. The scandals undermined the Republican Party's moral authority. President Ulysses S. Grant, once the war hero who had saved the Union, became associated with corruption and cronyism. Although Grant himself wasn't directly involved in most of these scandals, his loyalty to corrupt aides and his failure to crack down on them damaged his reputation. The public was growing weary of what they saw as a corrupt and ineffective government. While political scandals rocked Washington, the economy delivered another gut punch to Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873, a worldwide depression, hit the United States hard, and it began with the collapse of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The railroad had been backed by Jay Cooke, a financier who had helped manage Union finances during the Civil War. When his firm went bankrupt, it set off a chain reaction, triggering the collapse of other financial institutions and sending shockwaves throughout the economy. The public blamed Republican financial manipulation, seeing the party as responsible for the collapse. The economic fallout was catastrophic. Factories and railroads shut down, and unemployment skyrocketed. Within a year, half of America's iron mills had closed, and by 1877, over 50% of the nation's railroads had gone bankrupt. Tens of thousands of industrial workers lost their jobs, leading to a surge in wandering tramps, desperate for work, camping by railroad tracks. Farmers were hit hard too, as crop prices plummeted and their livelihoods disintegrated. The once thriving Reconstruction economies in the South ground to a halt. The situation was dire in the South. Southern states, which had hoped for massive Northern investment to rebuild their shattered economies, found themselves left behind. Northern investors, already burned by Confederate bond defaults, were unwilling to risk more capital in the unstable South, especially after the panic. Southern state debts mounted rapidly as public projects like railroads, public schools, and health services became too expensive to maintain. The economic downturn also exposed widespread corruption in Southern Republican governments. The Republicans had banked on economic growth to sustain Reconstruction, but when that growth didn't materialize, state governments struggled to make ends meet. In some cases, officials resorted to bribery and fraud to keep projects moving. For example, one former Union general doled out more than $200,000 in bribes and loans to legislatures in exchange for millions in state funds for railroad construction. The railroads were never built. Officials instead speculated on bonds and pocketed the money. Even respected black leaders weren't immune to scandal. Robert Smalls, a hero of the Civil War who had become a state legislator in South Carolina, was convicted of accepting a bribe. Although he was later pardoned, the case weakened the fragile trust between African American leaders and their communities, as well as between Republicans and their supporters in the North. The collapse of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company in 1874 was another devastating blow to African Americans. This private bank, closely associated with the Freedmen's Bureau, had promised to safeguard the savings of former slaves. Thousands of black depositors had put their faith in the institution, but mismanagement and reckless investments led to its failure. When the bank collapsed, 61,000 depositors lost their savings, and Congress refused to compensate them. Many freedmen, already struggling to survive in the new economy, were left destitute and disillusioned. As the economy crumbled, so did the resolve of many Northern politicians and voters to continue the costly and controversial project of Reconstruction. Classical liberals within the Republican Party, advocating for free trade, small government, and a limited electorate, began to criticize the interventionist policies of radical Reconstruction. These liberal Republicans, tired of government corruption and Northern involvement in the South, called for a return to laissez-faire economics and sought to limit voting rights to educated, property-owning men. In 1872, these disgruntled Republicans formed the Liberal Republican Party and nominated Horace Greeley for president. Greeley, a former abolitionist, now called for reconciliation with the South. The Democrats, still in disarray, also backed Greeley, but he was a poor campaigner and failed to inspire confidence. Grant won re-election, but the fractures within the Republican Party were deepening, and the public's support for Reconstruction was wearing thin. Meanwhile, Southern resistance to Reconstruction grew increasingly violent. white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror and intimidation to suppress black political participation and drive Republicans from office. Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, vowed to redeem their states from Republican rule and restore white supremacy. They systematically dismantled Reconstruction reforms through both legal manipulation and brutal violence. By the late 1870s, the Northern resolve to enforce Reconstruction had all but collapsed. The cost of military intervention in the South, combined with economic hardship and political scandal, had worn down public support. Only a full-scale military occupation could have kept Reconstruction alive. But the North no longer had the willpower to continue. In 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, marking the official end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction's collapse left the South's racial and social hierarchies largely intact. The federal government abandoned the freedmen, leaving them vulnerable to a new era of oppression. The promises of equality, land, and freedom faded, as Jim Crow laws and sharecropping entrenched a system of racial segregation and economic exploitation for generations. In our final episode, we'll explore the rise of Jim Crow and how the South's post-Reconstruction society laid the groundwork for a century of racial inequality and division.